if you don't know already that I have this thing to try to talk about and write about maturity. And the core question of what is the difference between a child and an adult, what marks that difference is intrigues me. And as I said, I talk about it and write about it, carry on about it, because most of what we try to do in therapy or in Musar is we're trying to point out aspects of the ideal relationship with Hashem, with each other, with ourselves. We're trying to point out these ideals that maybe somebody didn't notice as an inference from a Chazal. So it could be viewed as like a GPS telling us how to get to a destination, but the GPS cannot tell us how to drive. That is assumed. So that the all of this growth is assuming that we're speaking to an adult who is able to integrate new information about how to grow onto a platform where they know how to be in charge of themselves. And so growth becomes relevant only if the person is already a maturing adult. You can't give those kind of instructions to a child or to an adult who carries on like a child. So the idea that therapy doesn't first address the question of helping the person flex the muscles of their maturation seems to me to be skipping the whole point. First, the person needs to be on a road towards maturing, and then they can talk about dealing with whatever challenges are on their plate. But otherwise, you're talking about dealing with challenges, and the person doesn't necessarily have the tools to be able to do that. So, what is the difference between a child and an adult? So, in general, the definition is that an adult and a child, that there are things that a child cannot do that an adult can do, and an adult can do it better and better over time. So that's the working definition. So, for example, something that an adult can do because they can reach a higher shelf and they can reach the cookies where a child cannot has nothing to do with their being an adult because it's not something that they can do better and better over time. And we've talked about this in the past. What I wanted to highlight is that becoming an adult is really about having more choices of how to respond to or impact a given situation or a moment. Okay? That means that a child has only one way to respond because his impulses or his nature, that's how he's going to respond. So the child is very predictable. An adult, by contrast, is able to be appropriate. And that means that they have more options up their sleeve. And Chazal tell us that one of the options that a person always has to have is the option of silence, of doing nothing, of not thinking about the question at hand. That doesn't mean that's the right thing to do. It could be that something should be said. It could be that it should be thought about. It could be that something should be done. It could be. But if there is not the option of saying nothing, of setting the feeling aside, of setting the thought aside, if that is not an option, then you cannot claim that whatever you did was a product of mature thought. So Chazal give us the blessing that silence is wonderful. Silence is golden. Silence is wonderful. And I believe that it doesn't mean that silence is always the right option. It means that silence must always be a option, and perhaps even a default option. But it is not always the right option. A person who is silent when something should be said or done, when an intervention is appropriate, can't be said to be better off because they were silent. So the approach towards adulthood is always going to involve an increased range of options. And that's one of the reasons why it's always hidden. Because since the person chooses from among the available options as to what they present in the world, what they say, what they do, they're presenting one outcome. They're not presenting the list of outcomes. They're not saying, I could be silent. I could put on an angry face. I could, but I choose to do the following. Nobody does that. That's not an appropriate intervention in the world because nobody can understand where you're coming from. But rather, it is the one thing that you see is the sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's the one thing that you see does not necessarily mean that it's either mature or immature, because if it's the only option that the person had, then it's impulsive, because they couldn't do otherwise, even though it appears very wise. So any given expression that a person makes, it's hard to say that was a very mature response. And that's why silence has the edge, because with silence, there's almost always the sense that there were more options, at least for most people, unless somebody who's just chronically silent. They have options and they chose to be silent. And so that is the gold standard, often described as the gold standard. But that does not by any means imply that silence is always the right response. So with silence as an option, then the other responses can be explored. And the child cannot explore those other options because silence is not an option for the child. And silence is almost always, again, aside from somebody who is compulsively silent or anxiety-driven silence, but if silence is one of the options, then everything else is a good possibility. And there's no right answer. There's no the correct thing to do to say the following, think the following, do the following. You don't get quite that black and white because it's so dependent on the nuances that a person sees in the environment. When a person has more options, they can be more appropriate. As they learn more about the situation, then they have more tools to be appropriate as well. Because the more you know about the situation, the better the likelihood is that you can be appropriate. Will you ever be absolutely appropriate? Then we leave that to Hashem. Hashem is absolutely appropriate because he knows the whole situation. He has every option. Those are the two key ingredients. If you have every option available and you know everything about the situation, then you can always be appropriate. We can never have all options available. We're human beings and we don't necessarily we're not so developed that we have every possible option, aside from the fact that we have limitations on what we can do. So we're looking at human equivalent of how many options we have and how well can we know the situation. Hashem has all options and knows the situation perfectly. We, on the other hand, have increasing options as we mature and an increasing awareness or understanding of the situation. The combination allows us to become wiser and more mature over time. So the opening discussion, and I know some of this we've mentioned in the past, but it's important to go back to it, that maturity involves going from predictable to appropriate. Predictable is the nature of the child, predictable because that's their nature, and they can only respond in accordance with their nature. But you would not want a 60-year-old to be having the same predictability of the 60-year-old, because that means they didn't evolve over the span of their lives. They didn't evolve to broaden their awareness of different options that they could express and more awareness of the reality such that they can become more appropriate. So the direction, the general direction of maturity is going from predictable to appropriate, and we're suggesting that having silence as one of the options is always the gold standard.